Okay, we have two sections to cover today. We have 4.3 and 4.4. We have shortcuts today that are designed to help you not need to know that all the sides are congruent, all the angles are congruent. So remember, last time we learned that congruent triangles means that all the corresponding sides are congruent and all the corresponding angles are congruent. Well, today are shortcuts. You don't have to know all corresponding angles and all corresponding sides are congruent. This is one shortcut. This shortcut says that if all the corresponding sides are congruent, that is enough to show that the triangles are congruent. So the easiest shortcut is side, side, side. What that means is that you have two sets of triangles where the corresponding sides are congruent. Those are congruent, those are congruent, those are congruent. That is enough to show that those two triangles are congruent. Again, is a shortcut. This is one of 5 shortcuts. 4.3 is all about side, side, side congruence. Looking at my examples real quickly here. It says, is the congruent statement true? There's 2 parts to this problem. The first part is, are they congruent? The second part is this statement correct? Because remember last time we talked about how to write those statements properly. So looking at this picture, just what's given to you is helpful, but that's not all that you know. For example, I know that this TR is reflexive, which means it is congruent to itself. Because of that, you can see that I have sides congruent, and of course this is congruent. So using side, 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 I know those two triangles are congruent. Because they're congruent, I'm allowed to write a congruent statement. That's what we learned last time. So to check this congruent statement, remember order is important. So the way this is written, this implies that RST and QTR, the angles that line up, are congruent. R and Q, are they congruent? Is S and T congruent? And is T and R congruent? Or you can look at how it's labeled. This one is RST. Look at the pattern. It starts up here, it goes down the 2 marking and then the 1 marking. This one says QTR. It goes down the 1 marking and the 2 marking. That tells you that it's not correct. It doesn't follow the same pattern. So to fix it, I'm going to keep this one as RST. So RST. The other one would be RQT. Do you see the difference between the way this one's written and the way this one's written? This one implies, and correctly, that the right angles line up. R and R, which is these 2 angles. Q and S, which is these 2 angles. And then T and T, which is these 2 angles. So this one is correct, this one is not. The next one, determine if those 2 triangles are congruent. Well, obvious, we have these 2 congruent because they're both 7. We have these 2 congruent because they're both 5. So we need to talk about this middle part. We have 2 here, we have 1 here, but we have this overlap of FC. So I want you to think about it this way. If we have, this is 2, this is FC here that we don't know. And then we have another segment that looks like this. This is FC that we don't know. Down here is 1. So in order for those 2 triangles to be congruent, this segment has to be the same as this segment, which is the same over here. We would need to know that BC and FE are the same length. That is not true. X plus 2 is not going to be the same as X plus 1. So the answer to that, determine if that's true, it's not congruent. Going to our proof. So this proof, pretty obviously, is going to be using side, side, side. So let's look at what's given to us. AB and CB are congruent. D is the midpoint of AC. As soon as you know it's a midpoint, that tells you that you're going to have 2 equal segments. And just like we've talked about before, you want to do a brainstorm idea before you do your proof. This is reflexive. So there's our side, side, side congruence that allows us to say those triangles are congruent. So doing my proof, writing down my givens. And then D is the midpoint of AC. That's also given. So as soon as I know it's a midpoint, then I know that AD is congruent to CD, and that's definition of midpoint. And then I need to say that DB is congruent to itself because of reflexive property. And now that I have 3 sets of sides congruent, we're going to say that those triangles are congruent because of side, side, side. So ABD is congruent to CBD using side, side, side. So side, side, side is one of our shortcuts, and that's 4-3. 4-4 has 2 other shortcuts. These are a little bit more tricky. Side angle side is written this way for a specific reason. It says side angle side, which means the angle is sandwiched between the 2 sides. If you look at the picture, we have a side, and that angle is sandwiched between them. This is a side angle side relationship, which is enough to say that those triangles are congruent. So this is true, just so that you guys see the difference. If I have those same 2 sides congruent, this is not side angle side. That angle is not sandwiched between the 2 sides. This is not side angle side. That angle is not sandwiched between the 2 sides. So I want to make sure you see the difference between side angle side and this one, which is not side angle side. In the front, hypotenuse leg. So hypotenuse leg only works for right triangles. That's really important that you know that, because there are no hypotenuse or legs in anything other than right triangles. So for this one, it says, first of all, you have to know that it's a right triangle. The hypotenuse is congruent and a leg. So looking at this picture, this is one scenario. Another scenario would look something like this. I have 2 right triangles, hypotenuse are congruent, and a leg is congruent. Remember, with a right triangle, you have 2 legs. We only need 1 set congruent. So either this set's congruent or this set's congruent. It doesn't matter. So you have to know it's right, hypotenuse has to be congruent, and then a set of legs. Looking at my examples, can you show the triangles are congruent using side angle side? So just like always, before you start jumping in, make sure there's anything else that can be marked congruent that aren't marked yet. So we have these 2 angles, we have these 2 sides. We can't say that these 2 are congruent. There's nothing that we know that's going to help us say that. And there's nothing that's going to help me say these 2 angles are congruent. The only thing we know is using the reflexive property to show that that middle section is congruent to itself. This is not a side angle side relationship. If it was a side angle side, you would have to know that this side is congruent, or you'd have to know that this angle is congruent. But with the information we have here, the answer is just no. In the next example, there's no additional information. We can't show any other angles are congruent. We can't show any other sides are congruent. This is all we have. And this is a side angle side relationship. Sides congruent, angles that are sandwiched. So the answer to this one is yes. The last one, can you show the triangles are congruent using hypotenuse leg? Before you use hypotenuse leg, make sure that it's a right triangle, and it is. This one's right, this one's right. So for hypotenuse leg, we need to know that the hypotenuse is congruent, and it is. Remember, the hypotenuse is across from the 90 degrees. That hypotenuse is congruent to this hypotenuse. We do have a leg congruent. This is reflexive. So we have a leg, the hypotenuse, and it is a right triangle. So the answer is yes. Be careful with these problems. Everything that's given to you isn't everything that you know. So don't forget about things that you've already learned. And I have one more proof over here for you. So let's talk about what we know. AB is parallel to CD. AB is congruent to CD, and we're asked to show that these 2 triangles are congruent. So thinking about what we know today, we know that you can find 2 triangles congruent knowing all corresponding sides are congruent, all corresponding angles are congruent. That's the long way of doing it. We could use one of our 3 shortcuts. It's possible that I might use side, side, side. It's possible to use side, angle, side. It is impossible to do hypotenuse leg, not a right triangle. So let's figure out what we can figure out just using what we got. Here's reflexive. I'm also given parallel lines. So if these are parallel, and here's my transversal. This angle and this angle are alternate interior, which means they're congruent. So I can say these two angles are congruent. So if you look at my picture, side and side with an angle that's sandwiched, two sides with an angle that's sandwiched. So we're going to prove this using side angle side theorem. And this is in your notes, it's also proved online, so I'm not going to make a long video about this, but this was my plan for it. Use reflexive, alternate interior, and the given side's congruent, and you can use side angle side to show those triangles are congruent.